forestry conditions that obviously they have up in Norway. So that's a supply vehicle or logistic vehicle to keep the armies going. At last, I hear you say, we're going to see a proper tank now coming on. And the tank that's coming on now, this is a tank that went into service way back in the 1960s at the height of what we now know as now as the Cold War. That was when the East, capitalist countries, might have been going to fight, the Western countries, capitalist countries, might be fighting the Eastern Bloc countries, i.e. the Soviet Bloc countries, the communist countries. Now, we knew at the time that the Russians were building thousands of tanks. We would never in the West be able to match them in terms of numbers, tank for tank. So what we happened to do in the West was we decided to use our technological advances to make a really impressive good tank that would be able to, and quite simply would have had to, if the Cold War had become hot, knock out at least half a dozen Russian tanks before it could get afford to be knocked out. Now, when they designed the Chieftain tank, it was still in that post-war period in the early 1960s when many in the British Army had memories of the German tanks at the end of the World War II, those bigger, heavier German tanks. And the British Army said after World War II, we are never going to war again with a tank that has a smaller gun or less armour protection than the enemy. And that was part of the thinking that goes behind the Chieftain that we're seeing driving around now. It is massively, thickly protected. We're looking at 60 tons of steel here. It's a very, very well protected tank. And it's also got probably the biggest gun, and it was certainly the most powerful gun put on a tank when it went into service at the end of the 1960s. Now that gun on the top there is what they call a high velocity 120mm gun. So what does that mean? High velocity, things come out the end of that barrel with a tremendous amount of force behind them. You can work that one out. 120mm, it's the size of the hole across the end of the barrel is 12 centimetres across, so 120mm. And this tank was designed with the idea it was going to have to knock out a lot of Russian tanks. So instead of firing a bullet-shaped round like we're used to seeing coming out the end of the barrel of rifles and pistols, what this gun fires is actually a piston out the end of the barrel. It starts at one end of the barrel, stationary in the breech of the gun, and by the time it comes out the end of that barrel, it's going at supersonic speed. The sides of the piston fall away when it comes out the end, and it leaves a 13-inch long metal dart flying towards the enemy tank at supersonic speed. Now that metal dart has got no explosives on it. It's got little fins on the back, just like a dart you throw at a dartboard, so it goes straight through the air. And it's made of either tungsten, which is twice the weight of steel, or depleted uranium, which is a waste product from the nuclear industry. And the whole idea is it's just the sheer kinetic energy, or the welly behind that round, that will smash its way through the enemy tank and out the other side. And they got this gun so accurate that a well-trained crew could hit a target out to 3 kilometres away 98 times out of 100 with the very first round. So basically what you're looking at, if this gun's pointing at you, forget it, you're a goner. It's that accurate and that powerful. Inside that turret, to service that gun, you've got 3 guys. You've got the commander, he's the guy in the top there with his head out the turret. He's looking for targets all the time, and he's telling the driver, who's right down the front of the tank, where to go, because he's a bit higher up, he can see things before the driver can. In front of the commander, in the turret, there's the gunner. He's the guy who's actually got the fine handling of aiming that huge 120mm gun. So he's the one who, once he's found the target, he's got a little trigger grip that he pulls to fire the gun. On the other side of the turret, with a little bit more room, is the loader. And if any of you ever have to pick a tank crew, pick your loader, someone who's short, stocky, built like a Russian shot putter, because the rate of fire of this tank will go down as the loader gets worn out, picking up these heavy pistons, putting them in the barrel of the gun, followed by a big bag of explosive that blasts them out. So you need someone very well trained, very fit, to keep that rate of fire up, because again, in tank combat, quite often it's the person who gets the most rounds off first, accurately, that's going to win the engagement. Driver, we said, he's right down the front, and he's almost driving that tank in what they call a supine position, almost laying on his back as he's driving it. And the whole idea is the lower he is, the lower the barrel can be, the lower the whole tank is, and therefore you're less of a target for the enemy, so there's less to see to be hit. And when the Russians got bigger guns put on their tanks, what do? We put more armour protection on our tank. So there's actually extra bit of new steel welded around the front of the turret, either side of the gun, that was added later. So you always want to be one step ahead of your enemy. More powerful gun, better protection. The one thing, unfortunately, that let the Chieftain down in service, fantastically powerful tank, was the engine at the back. Those of you remember, this was the era of British Leyland. The engine in the back there was something called the Leyland L60 engine. It was supposed to be a multi-fuel engine. You could do anything with it, put vodka in it, petrol, diesel, it was still supposed to run. It just didn't. Unfortunately, it was a bit unreliable, and that was the one thing that let the tank down. So it had fantastic gunnery, fantastic protection, not so great mobility. Now, what we're going to ask the crew to do now is something they would never do in a combat situation, and that's go on top of the mound behind us here, because why you never do that normally is tank crewmen are told never show their tanks off. Keep them hidden from the enemy to the last possible moment. Hide always behind the hill. Keep behind the hedge. The enemy are going to hear you coming with that massive note of engine there, but you don't want to show yourself off to the last possible moment. So we're actually going to make him do something so you can see him, just so you can also see how mobile a big heavy tank can be.
Good girl.
So I said, we paint camouflage schemes on the tank.